one of the things that happens when you look at Tainter's view of complexity, you can get a feeling of despair because it feels like this is inevitable. But even Tainter doesn't think that. In chapters 6 and 7 of The Collapse of Complex Societies, he talks about how you can occasionally get out of the situation and that not all collapse is actually bad, but we'll come back to that. So in direct opposition to both architectural spirals, epistemic spiraling, and diminishing returns of specialized systems, which again is not unique or limited to post-industrial computer systems, even though I talked about that last time. There are several engineering principles, philosophies, and counter movements that have emerged that we can use on the left to deal with this problem. The problem is we're not temperamentally set up for it. Our class basis is we tend to be fairly specialized even when we're in the working class, hence the white collar nature of a whole lot of the people working in it. And the fetishization of the working class also is often based on ignoring what has happened to them and their own forms of hyperspecialization, which also happens on the factory floor, but in a different way. So we can apply some things to start thinking about ways out of this that we don't normally apply and might help socialists and Marxists think about ways to deal with this. But they're principles. I'm not going to have a whole lot of things that are going to give you exact things to do right now. And I want you to realize that. And I admit these last videos, this one in particular, has been a very much a eat your vegetables kind of video, but we're going to come back to the important stuff because I feel like right now these are insights that leftists just ignore. All right. These paradigms treat complexity not as a natural mark of technical sophistication, like, the way Baroque sophistication looks cool, but as an existential liability because of its cost. Its metabolic cost, more than its money cost. We're not so much concerned about money. Money is not actually the thing that moves the world. Energy is. A tax on a system stability, it's a tax on human cognition, and it's a tax on the long-term viability if things get overly complex. So one, we can look at Gall's law. Formulated by a pediatrician and a general systems theorist, John Gall, in a book in the 1970s called Systemantics, How Systems Work and Especially How They Fail, which is kind of a fun name. Gall states his law as the following. A complex system that works is invariably found to have evolved from a simple system that worked. A complex system designed from scratch never works and cannot be patched up to make it work. You have to start over with a working simple system and build from there. So there's some core axioms that flow from this, from when you're dealing with social systems are engineering machines. You should not attempt to design an idealized, fully distributed, multi-reason, horizontally scaled architecture on day one because it is impossible and it's overly complex and would not work. Because the failure modes of such systems are nonlinear and emergent, these systems collapse under unforeseen operational friction are the weight of kluges, in addition to their needs for an increasing amount of resources to do the same thing they used to do. 2. A simple system survives because its operating parameters and its boundary conditions are fully understood by all operators. Complexity can only be introduced incrementally in response to actual observed environmental stress, rather than a hypothetical future scale. And that makes a lot of AI development very strange, doesn't it? You kind of want to throw John Gall's work at Sam Altman's head. Then you have boring technology ethos, which comes from Dan McKinley. Now, I'm putting this from the bourgeois world, but sometimes the bourgeois world is helpful. It provides us with an economic and cognitive framework for resisting adoption of novelty for its own sake if it increased energy or engineering cost. He uses a token innovations model. Every engineering organization has strictly finite cognitive budget, or you only have so much cognitive load. You can only think about so much. You represent it metaphorically as innovation tokens, usually 2 or 3 tokens per project. Spinning tokens means adopting an unproven, novel, or bleeding edge technology. Exciting technologies come with unknown failure modes, immature debugging tools, scarce documentation, zero functional familiarity, and they're often built on top systems that weren't built for them. Be boring. Boring does not mean bad. The failure modes are well apt and widely understood. Use simpler modes that are more understood when you can, as opposed to most complex ones. This becomes an operational heuristic. I find that's very useful. A lot of things we use technology for is using way more complicated systems, even if not complicated to the user end. Maybe it's complicated on the back end to do something that's relatively simple. Now, handwriting is not relatively simple, actually. It involves advanced cognitive load, fine motor skills, loss of training. However, computers exponentially grow that. I often handwrite my first drafts of things. In fact, on one of these shows, and I've shown this on live streams, I will often, when I'm coming up with one of these talks, go through and handwrite my initial points down and then build from there. All right. So be willing to be boring in building a system. Be willing to piggyback off of prior models. This is actually useful when we talk about reform versus revolution, right? Like sometimes you are building off things that already exist. There will never be a true year zero. And if you do build a year zero, it will be remarkably simple, aka almost Stone Age like. Right. But this actually is a form of discipline that you have to implement in your organizations. So whether it's a business or a political movement, you're going to need to be complexity conscious on your architecture. If you are overly federated, you're going to have a lot of redundant systems that are going to be useful, but they're going to be costly. See the DSA. If you're overly centralized, you're going to be given to cascade failures and still might not protect against over complexity. See most sectarian organizations. So these are things that you should really look out for as you're designing. But let's talk about this, because even these principles are ways to reduce complexity. Think about minimalism and Gall's law and being boring. Why did hyper-complexity remain the default in the industry, and why did they remain the default in our general society? One, bureaucratic capture is real. To go to Robert Mickles, the more complex a system is, the more easier it is to hide who controls it, and the easier it is to hide who control it, the easier it is to will power in a hidden way. Engineers and managers are incentivized by the labor market to adopt complex buzzword-heavy technologies to signal marketability. It hides what they're actually doing. Even if the business problem only requires a single shell script or a simple database. Multi-billion-dollar enterprise cloud industries economically benefit from complexity. The more moving parts, abstractions, and compute nodes a client runs, the higher the monthly cloud computation invoice can be, and the deeper the platform lock-in is. And the deeper the platform lock-in is, the harder it is for people to change. But you add more and more complexity to the fix, and then all of a sudden you have Facebooks which barely works. The enshittification is a lot of times intentional, but it also comes from diminishing returns. Organizations which confuse the scale of impact with architectural complexity often are doomed to fail. Systems serving millions of users or people trying to run a worldwide political campaign frequently run on remarkably lean, simple architecture, simple command structures, etc., as opposed to processing minimal traffic with a dozen-tier system and starting with a massive bureaucracy overlay. It doesn't work. But this is why trying to bring pouring old wine into new wineskins also doesn't work. What happens when you do that? That metaphor is lost on people today. Wine expands. If you've already expanded the capacity of your wineskins by having the wine expand, when you pour new wine into it, you're gonna get more wine in there, and then it's gonna expand. And the brittleness of an overexpanded wineskin explodes. That happens to a lot of these systems. So getting out of the tainting, the tainter, diminishing returns curve is really hard, because what you're doing is engineering simplicity deliberately to counterbalance the tendency to build complexity as a response to problems. So you're trying to make trade-offs so that you maintain a relatively simple system. In human systems and technology and whatever, this is hard to do. And there's 1,000 incentives not to. And this is a crisis for socialist strategy. For nearly 2 centuries, classical socialist theory from the Second International up through the mid-20th century labor movement relied on specific structural preconditions created by industrial capitalism. Physical concentration of workers in large factories and offices, which we call the slop floor. If you read Marx and Engels, they think this is going to be inevitably centralizing. Read On Authority, where Engels talks about this. He's wrong, by the way. It's one of the few things where I think Engels is transparently and objectively wrong, but nonetheless. There's homogenizing effects of industrial labor creating a coherent collective identity, which does not happen in other forms of labor. And the development of assumption of capital that builds productive and technological forces can simply be seized, democratized, and repurposed under workers' control becomes a problem. You can't just democratize this because the sunk costs are already built in, and you can't just undo them by having a different person running them. This is also a problem of reformism, but no one wants to deal with that because the implications of this are really dire. The dynamics discussed above undermine every single one of these assumptions. Classical organizing, as we've stated many times on this channel, relied on spatial proximity. The physical workplace served as an incubator for social capital, mutual aid, and strike capacity. This is why gigification hurt. This is why return to piecework hurt. And this is why specialization hurts. Particularly when you're dealing with algorithmic piece rate or platform logistics that replace factory work with dispersed, dynamic, and isolated nodes, or even things as simple as franchising and legal distributions like this. You get franchise workers, gig workers, service workers, fragmented subcontractors, remote workers. The default size of the class formation dissolves, and the ability to get huge groups of people at once dissolves too. Socialists cannot rely on workplace first trade unionism as the exclusive engine of politics anymore, whether we want to or not. It does not mean that I've ever suggested that we should abandon the working class. In fact, I think we can't. But it does mean that a lot of the assumptions of the classical labor movement that I talk a lot about, such as like the reason why we rely on the workers, they can reproduce society, an overcomplicated society, I don't know that anyone can reproduce it, which is part of the problem. So organizing has to shift in a bunch of ways. It shifts towards geographical organizing, such as tenant organizing. That's what that really is. Sectoral organizing, such as, associations of workers in multiple fields together, and in computational nodes, as well as focusing on logistics. So debt resistance network, wildcat logistics actions, tenant unions, data cooperatives. These things actually are going to be necessary, in addition to traditionally building out working class institutions, which have to really come from below as much from above to get buy-in today. Seizing the means of production thus can, under this Tainter model, be insufficient and maybe even a trap. And that's something that I think hurts Marxism's assumptions the most. There's a Promethean view that socialists can simply capture the existing capitalist techniques and run them for human need, as opposed to how they're run now. Now, I still think capitalist technology is a great and terrible thing that has enabled us to do many things in the future that we wouldn't be able to do without it. But there's diminishing returns there. Modern infrastructure requires massive energy inputs, continuous surplus extraction, violence, a massive violence capacity in a massive blue water navy that's willing to wreak havoc on the world, and opaque managerial bureaucracies to merely avoid collapse. And it is beginning to weaken and collapse. That's why all this nationalism and stuff is coming back to the fray. If socialist movements take political power in a society trapped deep in the flat end of a Taintering curve, it inherits an immense coordination tax immediately. And historically, socialists haven't won in this time period. Socialists have come to power when things have collapsed already, not before, historically, which I think should make everyone uncomfortable. Attempting to maintain a hyper-complex, brittle legacy system without capitalist market discipline and despotic managerial oversight often results in system bottlenecks, a regression to bureaucratic command economies, which themselves replicate the brittleness of the capitalist command system. I'm not against economic planning. I'm not one of those people who turns against it. I don't agree with Vivek Chibber on this. However, I do think we have to deal with the fact that just because something is democratized and socialized doesn't mean its technical debt goes away. Socialist strategy must incorporate intentional de-complexification as well as technological resilience. It's got to use some of those principles we get from other things. We have to be willing to be boring. We have to be willing to simplify things. Not simplify things in just, a lot of people think when I talk about simplification that I mean simplifying your messaging. Just being like the 99 versus the 1%. One, I think that's populism, and two, I think it's dishonest, and three, and this is the most important part, I think it doesn't work. The reason why I think it doesn't work is that it appeals to one's immediate situation and the severity of inequality, but then people look around and they realize they don't experience life in this simple of a way, and just invoking this as a mantra or as a slogan doesn't really get around that. Furthermore, hyperspecialization does make class coherence a lot harder. The working class is no longer structurally homogenous. It's no longer hard hat wearers. I'm sorry, although the worker is populist who want to pretend that, whether you be Jacobin Magazine or some podcast in Canada, it's not true anymore, if it was ever true. The social distance between a cloud platform engineer and a delivery driver building a shared class consciousness is an active pedagogical and political task rather than something that happens spontaneously because of what goes on the shop floor. And that's not just true between the white collar and blue collar. It's also true between the blue collar and blue collar. I would say the data center builder and the miner and the trucker also don't have clear interaction in the same way anymore. Socialist organizations thus must develop a politics of transition and cross-sectoral leverage. You got to be able to utilize truck points and linguistics and all this. Otherwise, you're going to be waiting for a collapse to work for you, which is where theories like communization came in the past. Algorithmic management makes this even harder. It turns capital into something structural, invisible, and ubiquitous into the social architecture. You can say the internet isn't your real life, but you're on your phones almost all the time. Don't worry, I am too. Because the manager is code and that's not human and not someone you can negotiate with, and the dynamic heuristics and traditional grievance mechanisms are gone, this makes it all more important. Socialist strategy cannot merely demand fairer algorithms. I wish it could. Coordinated manipulation of dispatch algorithms need to be fought. Building worker-owned digital logistics networks that operate with boring principles, boring technology principles, avoiding speculative venture capital burns like Uber or Amazon, or anything super exotic, to things that we know are basic and work and simple and you can teach quickly. And then we need to be advocating for algorithmic transparency and public owner of core data sets as fast as we can. I think the implications for this are the abandon like Promethean reformism for some kind of resilient dual power model. But it's a big ask. We'll talk about it more, but I think we're going to talk about the vision thing first. If hyper-technological capitalism drives atomization to destroy solidarity, uses algorithmic price races to extract reserve labor, and piles on more and more complexity to make society brittle, lonely, expensive to run, and alienating to all that are in it, The socialist project cannot simply be the democratization of existing complexity. It can't, as much as I love Lee Phillips's work sometimes, it's not going to be just turning the taps on at the Walmart, but socialistly. You have to liberate humanity from a coordination trap. This means reclaiming both species beings by reducing non-productive systemic overhead, dismantling algorithmic surveillance, and creating simple, inspectable, human-scale democratic institutions that are capable of surviving diminishing returns of the current economic order, because it is going to happen. Entropy exists. No, we're not a closed system, but don't think that's a magical fix that gets you out of the problem of diminishing returns. On the next video, we'll talk about logistics-centered labor strategy as a way to maybe work around this. And then we'll end on the vision thing. Then we're going to go to Plato. This will conclude our kind of long series. The first series was specific problems of the DSA and strategy. This is a much more meta strategy issue. I hope you get a lot from these. I know they're a little bit more technical than you're probably used to here. And in some ways, maybe listening to them isn't the best way to get the information, but it's what you're being given. I might write this down in the future, who knows. On that note, protect your peace, like and subscribe, hit the bell. There's more behind the Patreon wall for as little as $4. You know the drill. Take care of yourself.